Thank you for coming for a visit to give me a chance to tell you who I am and what kind of writing I'm interested in. My name is Sergio Troncoso, or Sergio Troncoso if you know Spanish. I grew up in El Paso, Texas, and I live now in New York City. I have right now 2 books. My first book was The Last Tortilla and Other Stories, and then I wrote a novel after that called The Nature of Truth. And so let me just tell you a little bit about, what I'm interested in as a writer, and what are some of the things I've worked on and why I've worked on them. If you give me a chance, I'm going to have a little cup of coffee in my Gryffindor cup. I have 2 boys who were heavily into Harry Potter when they were younger. So I grew up in El Paso, Texas. Both my parents were from Mexico. They were from Chihuahua. And they came over in the 1950s and first got their green cards and then eventually became American citizens. So they really came over here with nothing. In fact, they had no money and could hardly speak the language. And they settled eventually in Ysleta, which is a town right on the outskirts of El Paso, Texas. And that's where I grew up. And Ysleta at that time was a colonia, which really just means that it was an unincorporated part of the city of El Paso. We had no running water for a while. We had just sort of a faucet where you would cart in the buckets of water. And we had kerosene lamps and stoves for a few years when my parents built their adobe house. So it was sort of like pioneer living. I loved it. It was sort of a crazy way to live. I'm an Upper West Side New Yorker now, so it seems like eons ago. But it was great to be a kid in that neighborhood in Ysleta. I think about 100% of the people there were either Mexican American or from Mexico. So you heard Spanish on the streets, and then from kindergarten I went to South Loop School and then eventually Ysleta High School, and you spoke English in schools. So it was really a bilingual upbringing, and I loved it. I loved playing in the canals and the ditches, the adventures we had finding snakes, living about a half a mile from Mexico. So going to Juarez, sometimes we would go to Juarez on Sunday nights for dinner because my parents liked to visit their hometown, and it's literally very close by. You can go to Juarez for a meal and come back to El Paso within an hour or 2. So the first book I wrote was mostly about growing up like that. And a couple of the stories are also set in New York City. But from that upbringing, I went to Harvard. And that was a huge cultural shock for me. It was like being on Mars. I was surprised that not everybody spoke Spanish. I was just shocked to be in the Northeast. I was shocked at how cold it was. I was very smart. I was very bookish. I loved to read as a kid. It was in many ways my story. The Snake is about me. This kind of fat boy who is sort of a loner on the border, and he loves to read, and then he ends up doing incredible things. So a lot of that is me. I would say some of that is also my brothers. But the move from Ysleta to Harvard was a huge move. And then eventually at Harvard I studied Latin America, and I studied Mexico in particular with people like John Womack. And one of the reasons I did that is because I really had learned almost next to nothing about Mexico and Mexican history, living in El Paso, living about half a mile from the border. So my first collection of stories, The Last Tortilla and Other Stories, is mostly about growing up in El Paso and Ysleta, the adventures I had there, and some of them, of course, made up. And eventually, after I finished Harvard, I I left and spent a year in Mexico City, studying the economy, because that was what I focused on at Harvard. And then I went to Yale and received 2 different graduate degrees, one of them in international relations and the second one in philosophy. One of the things I have always loved is philosophy and literature. That was one of my favorite courses. I TA'd with Maurice Natanson, who was a philosophy professor at Yale. And reading people like Camus and Tolstoy, Sartre, Dostoevsky, even Faulkner. These writers that would tackle very difficult issues, moral issues, philosophical issues, questions of the self, through literature, through stories. And the very first story I wrote, The Abuelita, is about this Yale graduate student calling his abuelita back home in El Paso, somewhat autobiographical, and discussing Heidegger's being towards death. And of course, the abuelita does not really understand the philosophy in a way, but in a way she really does. And so this was living in very different worlds, beginning in Ysleta, going to Harvard and going to Yale, often informs a lot of my fiction. The other story, I wrote a love story that is very popular, has been anthologized in many different places, Angie Luna, about this Chicano, Mexican-American student who comes back to El Paso and he falls in love with a Mexicana, and it questions where he belongs. Does he belong in English, in Spanish? Does he belong in Mexico, in the United States? And so these love affairs end up questioning his sense of self and where he belongs. My novel also tries to straddle different places, different cultures, different languages. I've been fascinated by philosophy for many years, so the novel is focused on this Yale graduate student, Helmut Sanchez, who discovers a 40-year-old letter that says some horrible things about the Holocaust. And he's half German and half Mexican, and he decides to find out who wrote this letter. And he ends up finding out that it's his boss. But he goes back to Austria, he goes to Italy to discover the origins of his boss and how he ended up at Yale. And it's about the pursuit of the truth, and when it can become an obsession, become something that makes you do things you otherwise would not do. And when is the pursuit of truth something informed by hatred? And how is that pursuit of truth warping of the mind and warping of the self? So my fiction in general and my essays tend to explore these questions of philosophy and literature. You won't find my prose or my fiction at Costco or Walmart, but I hope that any reader that picks up my books, I will be able to ask questions that the reader is also asking, and delve into problems and issues that we all face at the kitchen table, with our spouses, deep philosophical issues that should get more attention in literature. So I'm really not, I love to be read, and I hope many people read my work, but my point is to try to explore deep philosophical issues in my work. And so I want to thank all of you for simply letting me talk for a few minutes and for listening to me. And if you do pick up one of my books or read one of my stories or essays in a journal, please send me an email. I keep a very active website. It's just my name, sergiotroncoso.com, and I also write a weekly blog, chicolingo.com, which focuses on writing, on politics, Latino issues, and even finance, given my economic background. So thank you again for listening for a few minutes, and I look forward to hearing from you.